What if the real question isn't whether the shift is coming, but whether your frequency will travel with it or stay anchored to what it's moving away from? The Sophia Council is not a metaphor. In the esoteric traditions that have mapped the governing intelligences of planetary consciousness, councils of this kind are understood as collectives of the highest frequency awareness, entities whose function is to hold the full map of a transition while individual souls are navigating it from inside it. What the council sees that you cannot see from inside the experience is the scope of the frequency separation that is already underway, the speed at which the divergence is accelerating, and the closing distance of the window in which crossing from one frequency band to the other remains accessible without extraordinary effort. When a council of this kind issues a warning, it is not doing so to frighten. It is doing so because the map they hold shows something that is not visible from the ground. We say, left behind, and the mind immediately generates an image, people being abandoned, separated, excluded, a divine selection process that leaves some out while others are chosen. This is not what the Sophia Council means by this phrase, and the distinction matters enormously. In the framework of frequency, left behind is not an action done to a soul. It is the natural result of a soul operating at a frequency that cannot travel with what is ascending. A frequency that is vibrating at a certain range cannot spontaneously move with a field that is transitioning to a higher range. It is not excluded, it is not punished, it simply cannot follow. The way a radio tuned to one frequency cannot receive the broadcast transmitting on a different one. What the Council is describing tonight is not a judgment, it is a physics. Before this transmission goes deeper, if something in that opening question landed in a place that felt less like curiosity and more like recognition, subscribe to this channel. This is where the Sophia Council's transmissions continue to reach those who are meant to receive them. The Apostle Peter wrote something in his second letter that the mystery traditions have been reading as a precise description of planetary frequency transition for centuries. He described the elements dissolving with intense heat, the old heavens and earth giving way, and in their place a new heaven and a new earth in which righteousness, alignment with the higher pattern, dwells. In the esoteric reading, Peter was not describing a physical destruction. He was describing the dissolution of an entire frequency band, the band the Sophia Council calls the old earth, and the emergence of a new operating frequency in its place. This is not a future event in a distant apocalyptic timeline. It is happening now. The dissolution of the old Earth frequency is the planetary frequency shift that the Sophia Council is monitoring in real time. And righteousness, alignment, is the frequency of those who will be carried when the old band dissolves. What is the old Earth exactly? Not a geographic location, not the physical planet. In the Sophia Council's language, the old Earth is a frequency state, a collective pattern of consciousness that has organized itself around specific operating principles. Fear as the primary motivator, external conditions as the source of inner state, survival and scarcity as the underlying premise of existence, and the unconscious repetition of patterns inherited from previous generations as the mechanism of continuity. The old Earth is the frequency of human consciousness operating below the threshold of genuine self-awareness, not because those in it are incapable, but because the field they have been embedded in has shaped the operating frequency they default to. The old Earth is not a moral category. It is a frequency band, and it is the band that the planetary shift is moving away from. The signs that a soul is operating primarily in old Earth frequency are specific and identifiable. The first is the sense that outer circumstances are the primary determinant of inner state. that you feel good or bad, expanded or contracted, hopeful or hopeless, primarily in response to what is happening outside you, rather than from a frequency you maintain independently of those conditions. The second is the pattern of circular movement. The same situations, the same types of relationships, the same emotional dynamics appearing with different names and faces across the years, without a genuine change in the underlying pattern. The third is the orientation of waiting, the pervasive sense that the life you were meant to inhabit is somewhere in the future, conditional on external events that have not yet occurred, rather than accessible as a frequency you can inhabit right now. If any of these are recognizable, this transmission is for you specifically. If something in those first paragraphs created a movement in you, a recognition, a discomfort, a readiness to receive what comes next, write in the comments, "I receive the warning." That phrase is the beginning of a frequency choice. The question the Sophia Council is asking every soul in this moment is not theological, and it is not judgmental. It is precise and it is practical. Which frequency are you actually operating from right now, underneath all the language and the seeking and the spiritual frameworks you've been building? Not which frequency you aspire to inhabit, not which frequency you believe yourself to be approaching. Which frequency is actually running your decisions, your emotional defaults, your relationship patterns, your response to difficulty? Because the frequency that is running those things, not the frequency you identify with conceptually, but the one that actually governs your moment-to-moment operating state, is the frequency that will determine whether you are carried by the shift or remain in the band the shift is moving away from. The first response many people have to the phrase "left behind" is fear, and that fear is worth addressing directly, because the quality of the fear reveals something important. If the fear that arrives when you hear "left behind" is a low-frequency fear, a contraction, a sense of smallness, a panicked reaching for reassurance that you're okay, that you're included, that you haven't failed, that response is itself an indicator of old Earth frequency operating in you. This is not an accusation. It is an observation that the Council asks you to sit with. The soul that is genuinely resonating with the ascending shift does not primarily feel fear when it hears this warning. It feels clarity. It feels a kind of urgent readiness, not to flee from something, but to move toward something. That distinction in how you're receiving this transmission right now tells you something important about where your frequency is operating. The warning is not punishment. Let this settle before the transmission continues. The Sophia Council is not issuing this warning because there is a cosmic authority that has decided to punish souls for choosing the wrong frequency. There is no punishment architecture in what the Council is describing. What there is a natural consequence that is as impersonal as gravity. The old Earth frequency band is transitioning. The shift is not a referendum. It is not a decision that souls get to vote on at the collective level. It is happening. The Council's warning is mercy, the act of saying, from the vantage point of those who can see the full map, here is what is moving, here is what the movement requires, and here is how much window remains for the choice to be made with the full range of ease that is currently still available. In the Gospel of Matthew, in the 24th chapter, Jesus describes the signs of the end of an age and includes a passage that has been interpreted in dozens of ways across centuries. 2 men will be in the field, 1 will be taken and 1 will be left. 2 women will be grinding, 1 will be taken and 1 will be left. In the esoteric reading, the reading that looks beneath the literal narrative at the frequency mechanics, what is being described is not a supernatural selection process. It is a description of what frequency separation looks like from the outside. 2 people in the same location, doing the same activity, living apparently parallel lives, and the frequency shift passes through. One is carried because their frequency was already in resonance with the ascending field. One remains because their frequency was calibrated to the band the shift is moving away from. Same field, same activity, different frequency, different outcome. The Gnostic tradition divided souls into three broad categories based on their dominant frequency orientation. The helics, from the Greek word for matter, are souls primarily oriented toward material density, whose operating frequency is locked in the patterns of survival, fear, and unconscious repetition. The psychics, from the Greek word for soul, are souls in the middle zone, capable of spiritual perception and aspiration, but not yet stably anchored in the highest frequency. The pneumatics, from the Greek word for spirit, are souls whose frequency is primarily oriented toward the divine light, who carry the spark of higher consciousness as their dominant operating frequency. What the Sophia Council wants to clarify tonight is that these are not fixed categories of being. They are frequency positions. A soul operating in hylic frequency is not condemned to remain there. A soul operating in pneumatic frequency is not permanently secured there. The planetary shift is the moment when the difference between these positions becomes consequential in a way it was not when the overall field was more stable. If this transmission is opening a question in you that matters, if you're asking yourself honestly which of these frequency orientations best describes how you're actually operating, let me know by liking this video. It matters. The helic soul, the soul operating in the deepest density of old Earth frequency, is not lost. This is the most important correction to the fear-based reading of what the Council is transmitting tonight. The hylic frequency is a position, not a sentence. It is a frequency state that is genuinely capable of shifting, and the planetary transition is creating conditions where that shift is more possible than at any previous point in the cycle. The old Earth frequency is becoming uncomfortable to inhabit in a way it wasn't before. The patterns that were sustainable in the old Earth frequency are producing results that even the souls most deeply embedded in that frequency can no longer rationalize as acceptable. This discomfort is not punishment. It is the pressure of the ascending field making the old operating frequency increasingly untenable. The discomfort is the invitation. What separates those who will be carried by the shift from those who remain in the old Earth frequency band is not spiritual achievement. It is not the accumulation of esoteric knowledge, spiritual practices performed, transmissions received, or years dedicated to awakening. Sophia does not operate a merit system. What separates those carried from those who remain is something far simpler and far more available, the genuine direction of the soul's orientation. A soul that is genuinely, even imperfectly, even partially, turning toward the ascending frequency, that is moving however haltingly in the direction of higher coherence, that is in genuine relationship with the question of its own frequency orientation, is in resonance with the ascending field in a way that a soul facing the opposite direction is not. Direction, not achievement. That is the variable the Council is assessing. The researcher and physician David Hawkins spent decades mapping what he called the levels of consciousness, a calibrated scale of frequency states that he documented across his clinical and research work. In his framework, the threshold at 200 on a scale of 1 to 1000 represents the dividing line between what he characterized as force and power, between frequencies that draw energy from the environment to sustain themselves and frequencies that generate coherent energy from within. Below 200, shame, guilt, apathy, grief, fear, desire, anger, pride, the operating frequencies of the old Earth, each one characterized by a different flavor of energy that is borrowed rather than generated, reactive rather than responsive, dependent on external conditions for its maintenance. Above 200 begins courage, the first frequency that is genuinely self-sustaining, that can face reality without requiring it to be different from what it is. This is not arbitrary division. It is a frequency threshold, and the planetary shift is moving in the direction above 200. What does old Earth frequency actually feel like from the inside? Not from a diagnostic perspective, but from the lived experience of inhabiting it? It feels like a persistent, low-grade weight that has been present for so long you've stopped noticing it as weight. It feels like the sense that life is something that happens to you, that you are primarily a responder to events, rather than the originating frequency from which events emerge. It feels like a particular relationship with time, the past as a source of ongoing injury, the future as the location of relief that never quite arrives in the present itself as a holding space between what hurt and what you hope for. It feels like the recurring sense that the version of yourself you sense you could be is always slightly out of reach. Visible, identifiable, longed for, but inaccessible from the frequency position you're actually in. If this feels familiar, you are not alone. This is the collective frequency of a civilization in its final phase of the old Earth cycle. The person who has been doing everything the spiritual traditions say to do, meditating, seeking, watching transmissions, reading the texts, setting the intentions, and still feels a gap between the frequency they identify with and the frequency they actually operate from. Sophia has a message for you specifically. The gap you're experiencing is not evidence that the practices are failing or that you are somehow constitutionally unable to shift. The gap is the evidence that the old Earth frequency is embedded deeper than the level where practices operate on the surface. The practices are real. The seeking is real, and the Council is saying tonight that the shift required at this stage is not another practice added to the existing stack. It is a decision about frequency orientation that goes below the level of practice, a genuine, deep consent to inhabit the ascending frequency rather than only reaching toward it from the position of the lower one. Old Earth frequency has a specific signature that makes it recognizable once you learn to feel for it. Circular patterns, the same dynamic appearing again and again with different cast members, the same emotional territory revisited without genuine movement through it. Chronic waiting, the orientation that positions the real life as conditional on something that hasn't yet occurred. The belief, operating below the level of conscious articulation, that outer conditions are the source, and outer conditions must first change before the inner state can shift. And perhaps most recognizably, the sense of carrying something whose weight is real, but whose origin is unclear, a heaviness that predates your current circumstances, that would still be present even if every external problem resolved. This is the signature frequency of the old Earth, not because you are broken, because you were born into a field that was already operating at this frequency, and the field shaped the default operating pattern before you had the awareness to choose differently. The specific patterns that lock a soul in old Earth frequency are worth naming directly, because naming them is the beginning of their dissolution. The first is the pattern of delegating authority over your inner state to the outer world, allowing what happens outside to determine what frequency you operate from inside. The second is the pattern of inherited identity, inhabiting a self-concept that was built from others' perceptions, others' wounds, others' limitations, and treating it as if it were the actual frequency of your soul. The third is the pattern of conditional worthiness, the operating belief that you must first achieve, resolve, improve, or be forgiven something before you are permitted to inhabit the ascending frequency. None of these patterns are your fault. All of them are addressable. The addressing begins with the honest recognition that they are running. Noah did not understand the physics of what was coming. He did not have a complete theological or scientific framework for the flood. what caused it, how it would work, when it would arrive, what would survive it. He had a warning from a source he trusted, a clear instruction about what to do in response to the warning, and the willingness to act on the instruction before the evidence of the flood was visible. This is the archetype the Sophia Council is pointing to tonight, not the archetype of the person who has everything figured out. The archetype of the person who hears the warning, trusts the source it comes from, and responds with genuine action before the urgency becomes impossible to ignore. Noah's frequency resonated with the ascending pattern, not because he was perfect, but because he was responsive. He heard, he moved, the frequency carried him. The most common confusion about the planetary shift is the belief that understanding it is what allows a soul to move with it. People spend years accumulating frameworks, models, cosmologies, and esoteric knowledge about the shift, learning its mechanics, its timeline, its stages, its signs, and all of that accumulated understanding does not automatically produce resonance with the ascending frequency. Understanding the mechanics of flight does not make you an airplane. You can have a complete intellectual map of the frequency shift and still be operating from old Earth frequency in your actual life, still allowing outer conditions to determine inner state, still inhabiting the circular patterns, still waiting for a future moment when the real version of yourself becomes available. The Council is not interested in your understanding of the shift. It is asking about your resonance with it. The Sophia Council sees the collective field in a way that is difficult to communicate through language, but this is the closest approximation. Imagine the frequency field of the planet as visible, as a landscape of light at different densities and intensities. What the Council sees in that landscape right now is a separation that is already occurring, not a future event. An active, ongoing process in which frequencies that are calibrating upward are visibly moving in one direction, and frequencies that are maintaining old Earth calibration are visibly remaining in another. The gap between these two frequency populations is widening. It is not yet at the point of impossibility of crossing. There is still window, there is still accessible distance. But the Council can see the direction of the movement, and they know from the full map that the window of easy crossing is not unlimited. This is why they are transmitting tonight. The paradox embedded in this warning is worth sitting with. The soul that receives this transmission as a threat, that hears left behind, and moves into a contracted fear state, into a reaching for reassurance, into an anxious assessment of whether it qualifies, is demonstrating old Earth frequency in its response. And the soul that receives this same transmission as a gift, that hears the same words and feels a clarifying urgency, a readiness to examine its actual frequency without defensiveness, a genuine desire to know the truth of its current position and choose from that truth, is already demonstrating a frequency that resonates with the ascending field. The warning itself is a frequency instrument. How you respond to it tells you something real about where you currently are. Final warning in the title of this transmission is not the Council saying this is the last video on this subject or that the door is about to slam shut forever. What it is saying is this: the gap between old Earth frequency and the ascending frequency has been growing, is growing, and will continue to grow as the shift progresses. What can be crossed with relative ease today, the distance between where old Earth frequency is and where the ascending field is, will require greater and greater effort as that gap widens. The window of easy crossing is not unlimited. It does not close tomorrow, but it is measurably narrower than it was a year ago, and it will be measurably narrower a year from now than it is tonight. This is what the Council means by final warning, not last chance forever. Last moment of easy access before the crossing becomes significantly harder. What happens to those who remain in old Earth frequency as the shift continues? Not punishment, not divine abandonment. The honest answer is continuation. Continuation in a pattern that increasingly diverges from the ascending field. The old Earth frequency does not cease to exist. The souls operating in it continue, but they continue in a field that is increasingly out of resonance with the direction the collective frequency is moving, which means the gap between their operating frequency and the available higher frequencies continues to widen. What becomes accessible from old Earth frequency, the possibilities, the experiences, the states of consciousness available from that band, narrows rather than expands as the shift progresses. This is not cruelty, it is physics. A frequency band that is not ascending in a field that is ascending finds itself over time increasingly separated from the resources and possibilities that the ascending field is generating. The Sophia Council speaks directly now to the person who is watching this and whose primary fear is not, "Am I left behind?" but something quieter and more specific. "I think it may already be too late for me." The person who has watched the years pass, who has seen versions of themselves that felt like the beginning of something genuine, and then watched the pattern reassert itself, and has begun to construct a private belief that they are somehow constitutionally excluded from the possibility of genuine frequency shift. The Council's message for that person is direct. The question you just heard yourself ask, whether it's too late, is itself the evidence that it is not. Old Earth frequency doesn't ask that question. Old Earth frequency has stopped asking. The very fact that there is a part of you that still cares, that still wants to know, that is still watching transmissions at whatever hour this is for you right now, is the evidence of a frequency that has not fully surrendered to the density. It is the evidence of the pneumatic spark that the Gnostic tradition said could not be extinguished. You are not too late. You are watching this right now. The departure of Lot from Sodom in the book of Genesis carries an esoteric instruction that gets lost in the drama of the destruction. Two angels arrive to pull Lot and his family out of the city before the devastation. And the specific instruction they give is, don't look back, don't return, not physically, not by turning to watch. And Lot's wife looks back, and she is transformed into a pillar of salt. The esoteric reading of this narrative is not about the physical looking. It is about frequency. Looking back in this reading is the act of returning in frequency to the pattern you're departing from, of allowing your frequency field to reattach to the old Earth pattern even as your external circumstances have begun to change. It is the soul that accepts the invitation to leave the old Earth frequency and then, in a moment of grief or nostalgia or fear, turns its frequency back toward what it is departing from. And the salt is the crystallization of that frequency return, the rigidity of a soul that is between two frequency positions, neither in the old Earth nor in the ascending field. The practical meaning of don't look back in the context of your life tonight is this. Returning in frequency to old Earth patterns looks like re-entering the circular thought that you've recognized as circular. It looks like allowing the outer conditions to pull your inner state back into reactive mode after you've made a genuine movement toward frequency independence. It looks like re-inhabiting the identity defined by others' perceptions after you've glimpsed the frequency of your actual nature. It looks like returning to conditional worthiness, to the "I can't fully inhabit the ascending frequency until X resolves." After the transmission has shown you that orientation is the variable, not achievement. Turning back is a frequency action. The Council's instruction is, recognize it when it begins, and turn back toward the ascending field. Not once, repeatedly, as many times as the turning back impulse arises. This is what the frequency orientation looks like in practice. The shift is moving. It has its own momentum, its own timing, its own trajectory that is not paused by individual souls being undecided. This is not said to create pressure. It is said to correct a common misunderstanding that there is unlimited time to consider, to postpone, to wait for a more convenient moment to examine the frequency question. The shift does not wait. The window of accessible crossing does not extend indefinitely while individual souls deliberate. The question of which frequency you're in when the shift passes through your life is a question that answers itself in real time, with or without your conscious participation. The Council's transmission tonight is an invitation to participate consciously, to make the frequency choice deliberately from awareness, while the window of easy crossing remains open, not from panic. From clear-eyed, present-moment choice, shifting out of old earth frequency does not look like achieving spiritual perfection. It does not look like having resolved all the patterns, integrated all the trauma, mastered all the practices, eliminated all the fear. It does not look like no longer being affected by external conditions or no longer feeling the pull of old earth patterns. It looks like this: a soul that, when it recognizes it has been pulled back into old earth frequency, chooses to return its orientation to the ascending field rather than settling back into the lower pattern. A soul that is genuinely in relationship with the question of its own frequency, that is not pretending the question doesn't exist, that is not performing a frequency shift while internally maintaining the old earth pattern. The movement doesn't have to be large, it has to be genuine. The specific orientation the Sophia Council says is sufficient for being carried by the ascending field is not a list of practices or a level of spiritual development. It is a direction. The soul that is genuinely oriented toward the ascending frequency, that is in honest relationship with the question of where its frequency actually is, that is making genuine movement, however small and imperfect, toward the ascending calibration, that is not pretending the shift isn't happening or that the choice isn't real, that soul is in resonance with the ascending field in a way that is sufficient, not because it has earned its place, because resonance is not about merit. It is about frequency correspondence. A soul that is genuinely moving toward the ascending field, even from a significant distance, is in resonance with the field's direction. And direction is what the shift can carry. The new Earth frequency is already accessible as a preview. This is important because the soul that has never experienced it cannot genuinely choose it. You have felt it. It arrived in moments that had a different quality than your ordinary operating state. A moment of unexpected peace that had no external cause. A moment of genuine clarity where the circular deliberation simply stopped and the direction was obvious. A moment of connection with another person or with nature or with something interior that carried a quality of rightness that your ordinary frequency doesn't produce. That quality, that preview of the new Earth frequency, is what you are being invited to choose as a permanent calibration rather than an occasional visitation. It is not foreign to you. You have already been in it. The question is whether you will choose to orient toward it as your default, rather than treating it as a gift that arrives unexpectedly and cannot be consistently inhabited. Elijah in the scriptural tradition is one of only 2 figures described as being taken up without physical death. Translated directly, bypassing the usual mechanism of departure. In the esoteric reading, what this describes is a frequency that had calibrated so completely in alignment with the ascending field that the old Earth frequency, the density of the material, could no longer hold it in its pattern. The translation was not miraculous in the sense of violating natural law. It was the natural result of a frequency that had, through its entire orientation and commitment, left no holding points for the old Earth pattern. Elijah did not achieve this through flawless execution. The scriptural narrative shows him at his lowest point, sitting under a tree, exhausted, asking for it to be over. And in that low point, the ascending frequency met him, fed him, sent him forward. The frequency was not contingent on his permanent high state. It was contingent on his sustained direction. The book of Revelation, in its 21st chapter, describes what comes when the old order has passed. A new heaven and a new earth, where God dwells with human beings, where every tear is wiped away, where death and mourning and crying and pain are no more, for the old order of things has passed away. In the esoteric reading, this is not a description of a distant future geography. It is a description of the frequency state that the ascending souls inhabit when the old earth pattern has dissolved from their operating field. Every tear wiped away is the dissolution of grief as an operating frequency. Death and mourning and crying and pain as the old order, these are the signature frequencies of the old earth band, the frequencies of a soul operating from fear, scarcity, and separation. And when that frequency band is no longer the operating band, those states, not as occasional visitors, but as the permanent background of existence, are no longer the environment. This is the new earth that the Council is carrying you toward. To the person watching this, who has sat with every word so far, and whose primary response is not clarity but heaviness, who is feeling the weight of the patterns named, the distance between where they are and where the ascending frequency is, and something that feels less like urgency and more like exhaustion, Sophia sees you. She sees specifically the exhaustion of having carried old earth frequency for a long time, in a body and a life that were genuinely trying to move in a different direction. She sees the accumulated weight of the patterns that were not your choice and were not your fault, but have been yours to carry. And she says this: the heaviness you're feeling right now is not evidence that you are too embedded in old earth frequency to cross. It is evidence of exactly how much the crossing matters. The soul that is genuinely in contact with the weight of the old earth frequency, that can feel its density without pretending it isn't there, is closer to the genuine shift than the soul that is performing ease it doesn't actually have. Your honesty about the weight is itself a frequency indicator. The Council's response to the fear of having missed the window is short and it is direct. No soul that is asking whether it's too late is too late. The asking is the frequency. Old earth density does not produce this question. It produces resignation, rationalization, or numbness. The question, the genuine, uncomfortable, honest question about where your frequency actually is and whether there is still time, is the evidence of the ascending spark that has not been extinguished. If you are asking, you are in the window. The window is open as long as the asking is genuine. What does responding to the Sophia Council's warning look like tonight? Not a ritual, not a ceremony, not a perfect internal state that you manufacture on command. It looks like an honest inventory, not of your spiritual achievements, but of your actual operating frequency. Where are you actually allowing outer conditions to determine inner state? Where is the circular pattern running? Where is the conditional worthiness structure active? And then, not after resolving those questions but alongside them, a genuine movement of orientation toward the ascending frequency. A decision, made from honesty rather than performance, to face the direction the shift is moving rather than the direction of the old earth pattern. That decision, made genuinely, is what the Council is asking for tonight. The people in your life who are anchored in old earth frequency will feel the pull of your shifting, not because you tell them or explain the transmission or invite them to change, because frequency is not invisible. When a soul begins to genuinely orient toward the ascending field, the souls that are deeply anchored in the old earth pattern feel the dissonance of the frequency difference without having language for it. Some of them will be drawn, their own ascending spark responding to the signal of yours. Some will resist, because your frequency shift threatens the patterns that their frequency is organized around. You cannot carry people whose frequency is choosing to remain in the old earth band. You can be a signal that the ascending field is real and accessible. That is what Sophia asks of you in those relationships. Not rescue. Signal. The quantum principle of resonance describes a dynamic that the mystery traditions understood through a different language. Frequencies that are coherent with each other reinforce each other, and frequencies that are not coherent with each other cannot simultaneously maintain their distinct coherence in the same field. In practical terms, you cannot simultaneously maintain old Earth frequency calibration and new Earth frequency calibration as co-equal operating modes. At some point, as the shift progresses and the gap between the two bands widens, the choice becomes increasingly binary. Not because the universe is forcing a verdict, but because the physics of resonance requires that the primary frequency you're running determine what you're in resonance with and what you're not. The old Earth frequency and the ascending frequency cannot indefinitely cohabit at equal intensity. Something in you is already choosing. The Council's transmission tonight is the invitation to make that choice consciously. In the 10th chapter of Isaiah and the 7th chapter of Revelation, what appears is the concept of the remnant, the portion of the soul population that is preserved through a period of intense transition and reconfiguration. In Isaiah's tradition, the remnant is not the most powerful, the most spiritually advanced, or the most morally impeccable. It is the portion that maintained its frequency orientation toward the divine, amid a collective that had largely abandoned that orientation. In Revelation's tradition, the 144,000 sealed on their foreheads are sealed not because of their achievements, but because the seal, the frequency mark, is placed upon them. In both traditions, the preservation of the remnant is not about merit, it is about frequency correspondence. The remnant carries a frequency that the ascending field can carry, and the ascending field carries it. The Council wants to say something directly about the word final in this warning. The use of that word is not manipulation. The mystery traditions have always used precision language when describing thresholds of transition, because imprecision at a threshold creates the most costly error. The error of treating a closing window as if it were unlimited. The window of easy crossing in this particular frequency shift is measurably narrower than it was a decade ago. The ascending frequency has moved further from the old Earth band. The effort required to bridge the gap has correspondingly increased. What the Council saw 10 years ago as an accessible walk across a field has become an increasingly effortful climb over a growing gradient. Final is the precise word for the moment when the Council, looking at the full map, determines that the available ease of crossing requires honest urgency in the transmission. Not panic, honest urgency. Being carried by the ascending shift does not feel like being lifted by an external force while you remain passive. In the daily experience, it feels like this. Decisions that used to require laborious deliberation begin to become clearer. The pullback into old Earth patterns, the gravitational force of the familiar density, begins to feel less automatic, less inevitable. Moments of genuine new Earth frequency preview. That peace without external cause, that clarity without deliberation, that connection without the usual friction, begin to occur more frequently and with less surprise. The gap between the frequency you identify with and the frequency you actually operate from begins to close. Not because you've finished all the inner work, but because the ascending field is doing some of the work of lifting from outside what your genuine orientation has made resonant with its direction. The specific things the Sophia Council asks you to release from your frequency field tonight are 3. The first is the belief that your frequency is fixed, that the pattern you've been operating from is your permanent calibration rather than a frequency position that is genuinely movable. The second is the conditional worthiness structure, the story that says you must first fix, achieve, or resolve something before the ascending frequency is available to you. The ascending frequency is available to the honest orientation right now without prerequisites. The third is the role of passive observer in your own frequency story. The position of watching your frequency as if it were happening to you rather than recognizing it as something you are genuinely participating in shaping in real time, including in this moment. If you are watching this while carrying grief for relationships, for people you love who are deeply anchored in old earth frequency and who are not, as far as you can see, choosing to examine that anchoring, Sophia speaks to this directly. The grief is real. The love is real. And the love cannot hold you in the old earth band for the sake of maintaining the frequency proximity to those you're afraid of leaving behind. This is one of the most painful truths embedded in the frequency shift. The souls you love are making frequency choices that are their own. You cannot make those choices for them. What you can do is make yours, clearly, genuinely, from the fullness of your love, rather than from the guilt of your departure. And from the ascending frequency, your love becomes more available to them, not less. A soul operating at a higher frequency is a more powerful source of genuine support than a soul that has suppressed its own ascending movement to maintain false proximity. The genuine frequency shift and the performed frequency shift are distinguishable to the Sophia Council, and it is worth being honest about the distinction. The performed shift looks like adopting the language of ascension, while continuing to operate from old earth frequency defaults in practice, speaking the words of the new earth while the actual operating pattern remains reactive, conditional, and circular. This is not condemned. It is a transitional stage that most souls pass through, a stage where the identification has begun to shift before the actual operating frequency has caught up. The Council sees this and does not reject it. But it is asking for something more tonight, a genuine examination of where the actual operating frequency is, without the protection of the performed version. The genuine shift begins with honesty about what is actually running underneath the spiritual language. Choose your frequency. This is not a request to have a perfect emotional experience. It is not a request to arrive at certainty before you're ready. It is the simplest possible instruction the Council can give. Face the direction the ascending frequency is moving, and do not face away from it. Whatever else you're feeling, whatever the outer conditions are, whatever the weight of the old earth patterns is in your field tonight, choose the direction. That orientation, held genuinely, is what the ascending field can carry. What the Sophia Council transmits alongside every soul that responds to this warning tonight is not a frequency upgrade delivered from the outside. It is its recognition, a precise acknowledgement of the ascending spark in the specific soul that has chosen to face the direction of the shift. In the mystery traditions, this recognition from a higher frequency consciousness has a specific function. It amplifies the signal of the soul's own ascending frequency, making it easier for that frequency to maintain its coherence against the gravitational pull of the old earth pattern. Sophia's recognition of your choice tonight does not do the choosing for you. It does something adjacent and important. It sees the choice and reflects it back with the clarity of a consciousness that operates from the full view of the map. You are seen. Your choice is seen. And what you choose tonight is seen by the Council. The most precise description of what the warning is this: the most merciful thing a higher intelligence can do for a soul that is in a window of choice is to tell it clearly that the window is a window, not to pretend the window is unlimited when it is not to cushion the truth with reassurances that make the urgency disappear, but to say, from the full view of the map, here is what the map shows. Here is where the frequency is going. Here is what the window looks like from where we stand. And here is the honest description of what choosing one direction versus the other actually produces. This is the mercy the Council brings tonight. not comfort that obscures reality, clarity that makes genuine choice possible. The very last words of the book of Revelation are not a warning. They are an invitation. The Spirit and the bride say, "Come." And let the one who hears say, "Come." Let the one who is thirsty come. Let the one who wishes take the water of life without cost. This is the final frequency of the prophetic tradition, an open invitation with no prerequisites beyond thirst. The Sophia Council ends this transmission with the same frequency, not with the threat of what happens to those who don't choose, but with the invitation to those who are thirsty. Thirsty for a frequency that is more native to them than the old earth band ever was. Thirsty for the version of existence that the ascending field is moving toward. Thirsty enough to choose the direction of that frequency tonight, even if the crossing is still in progress. Come. That is the full message. Come. The ones who will not be left behind are making a choice right now. Not in some future moment when they feel more ready, not when circumstances align more conveniently, not when the shift has produced more visible evidence that it is real. Right now, in this transmission, in this moment of reading and receiving and sitting with the weight of the question, the choice is not made by finding the right words or manufacturing the right emotional experience. It is made by allowing the honest answer to the Council's question to be real. Which frequency are you actually operating from, and which direction are you genuinely willing to face? And from that honest answer, choosing the direction of the ascending field, not perfectly, not permanently, as a guarantee that removes all future struggle, as a genuine this-moment orientation. That is what carries you. If you stayed until the end, if this warning reached you the way the Council transmitted it, with full weight and full mercy, write in the comments, "I respond to the warning. I move with the shift." I have placed another transmission on your screen right now. Your next step from inside the choice you just made. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.